Resident Evil is a name that should be familiar to anybody who plays video games. With over 25 years of releases and more re-releases than you can imagine, Capcom's golden child is one of the most prolific brands in video games. From creating the term survival horror to creating one of the greatest action games ever made, Resident Evil has had a major impact on the video game industry. That's not to say that it's the perfect franchise by any stretch of the imagination. It's had its high points, but it's almost certainly also had its low points. However, it has recently managed to climb back out and reclaim its throne as the king of survival horror. Despite me being so big into horror games, I only recently got into Resident Evil a couple years back, and it's been a fairly slow journey. I played the original a few years back, and then took a break of about 2 or 3 years before finally playing the second and third games. After that, the snowball had gained enough momentum for me to blast through the rest of the mainline series. In the last year alone, I've played more than my fair share of Resi games, and I still haven't even scratched the surface of the franchise. Oftentimes I like to pick out a series and challenge myself to go through as much of it as possible, and sometimes I give up after a few games. But something about this series has kept me going, even after completing some of the games multiple times. Today, I want to explore this, and see just why is it that I've fallen in love with Resident Evil.
There are only 3 STARS members left now. Captain Wesker, Jill, and myself.
Before we get into it, I want to quickly touch base on just how big this series is. On the surface, for a series that's over 25 years old, it doesn't actually seem that big with only 8 mainline entries. That's about as many entries as Yakuza has had, and Resident Evil has an extra 10 years on the scene. After you finish a few games, you might think that you've started making progress, only to check the Resident Evil wiki and see just what you're up against. I like to think that I'm a fan of some pretty complicated series, but I haven't played anything that hits the level of spin-offs that Resident Evil has. There are over 25 Resident Evil games, and that doesn't include all of the Japanese-only mobile games, re-releases onto other consoles, or collections. Fun fact, Resident Evil 4 has been ported more times than Skyrim, including mobile ports and whatever a Zeebo is, and with an upcoming remake on the horizon and a VR port, that number is only going up. According to Capcom's own sales figures, there are 141 titles in the Resident Evil series, including re-releases and different versions, a number only matched by Mega Man. And honestly, when you look at the numbers, it's no surprise why. Out of Capcom's current top 5 selling games of all time, 4 of them are Resident Evil, and before Monster Hunter World was released back in 2018, Resident Evil 5 and 6 were Capcom's best-selling games. Not Street Fighter 2, not Devil May Cry, not even Mega Man. When it comes to series total sales, Monster Hunter is still a good 41 million sales off Resident Evil's title of the highest selling Capcom franchise. This is all without even dipping our toes into the well of movies, both live action and animated, and the Netflix series that is currently in development. Resident Evil is the cash cow that never stops producing gold. Even 5 and 6, which are highly regarded as the low point of the franchise, still hold that title of being in the top 5 highest selling games. What gives it this staying power? Why do people love it so much? Why do I love it so much? There's an argument to be made that this series has quantity over quality, and while I think that's definitely true, I don't think it's 100% the point. If Resi was a terrible franchise, it wouldn't matter how many low quality, terrible spin-offs they pumped out. Nobody would buy them. How is it that a game like Operation Raccoon City can outsell the original release of Dead Rising? What makes Resident Evil different?
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
One thing you'll notice when looking at Resident Evil is that there really isn't one definitive style. Resident Evil certainly has the biggest identity crisis of all of Capcom's franchises. You can pretty easily break it down into eras: the classic era, the action era, the spin-off Hell, and the current era, which is return to horror, I guess? Honestly, that last one is a little flimsy, but if you look at their output during the 2010s and the 360 generation, you can see how dramatically different the franchise was. I mean, the last game to come out before Resident Evil 7 was Umbrella Corps. This is the difference a year makes in Resident Evil. The 360 generation was a particularly hard time on the franchise. Following up what is now hailed as one of the greatest games ever made was a tough task, and with Capcom themselves declaring that survival horror doesn't sell, the series hit a weird period. Suddenly, Resident Evil was a purely action series. They were entirely co-op, and long gone was the day of fixed camera angles and tank controls. In a weird way, Capcom were kind of correct, because again, 5 and 6 were the highest selling games for them for a long time. This is all easy for me to say as a new fan, because I didn't have to go through the agonizing wait for each of these games to release, only to see Capcom pump out some of their worst rated games in their catalog. But looking at the series as a whole, there really is something for everyone. Want a classic survival horror kick? You've got the original PS1 trilogy. Only have access to a PS4 but want to try them anyway? Resident Evil Remake is right there. Want a stupid co-op shooter to kill time during quarantine? There's tons of them, on every platform. Want some really good single-player action? No matter what console you own, I guarantee you can play Resident Evil 4. When I got to RE6, I was a little worried because I had heard some pretty bad things about it. But when I played it recently with a friend of mine, I had a great time. Sure, it's not an intense, ammo-preserving horror, nor is it a perfectly designed masterpiece. Hell, it might not even be objectively a very good game, but it's got one thing that a lot of other games don't. It's fun. It's bombastic, it's got tons of returning characters, and it just feels really fun to shoot things. On the other hand, if you know anything about this channel, you'll know that I love me some classic horror, and I can't tell you how many times I've beaten Resident Evil 2 across both its original version and the remake. No matter what mood I'm in, I know that I can load up a specific Resi game to match that mood. Without dating this video too hard, in current year, having good co-op games to play with friends online has been an absolute godsend. So even though there's no real consistent gameplay, there are very few examples of bad mainline Resident Evil games. It just depends on your persuasion for the most part.
Trust me. This ends now.
With any long-running franchise, there's a certain percentage of the audience that are in it for the long haul, no matter how bad it gets. No matter what changes are made, they're sticking with it until the bitter end. Resident Evil has been around long enough that there's certainly a large percentage of the audience that will buy anything with Resi on it just because they've already come this far. So you'd think that a franchise that has been going on for this long would have some huge overarching plot, or a really well fleshed out world that has our characters traveling the globe to— okay, I can't even jokingly say this. Resident Evil isn't exactly known for its groundbreaking stories. Hell, I couldn't even begin to tell you what the hell's going on in 6. Instead, this story is all about one thing: characters. Resident Evil's world and story exists for one reason: to give us an excuse for a group of lovable and insanely attractive lads and ladies to do something. When I first explored the RPD in Resident Evil 2 and got to the STARS office, I was having a blast trying to figure out whose desk was whose, seeing the little flashes of character that symbolized each member. As far as characters go, it's very rare that one character gets to stay in the driver's seat for more than one game in a row, and their willingness to swap and change around characters is kind of nuts when you think about it. There are very few video game characters like Chris Redfield, who you can watch over the course of 25 years develop from a baby-faced cop to a boulder-punching pile of muscles. I remember the smile on my face when I first saw Sherry in Ori 6, or when Jill returned in Resident Evil 3, or when Barry first gets off the boat in Revelations 2. Resident Evil is a series built and carried on the backs of its characters. It doesn't matter what new country or virus that the games are about, it's all about whether I'm going to see Leon Kennedy suplex someone and then make a quippy line.
Your right hand comes off?
To emphasize this, let's look at my least favorite Resident Evil game so far.
Resident Evil 0.
Resident Evil 0 was a GameCube game that came out around the same time as Resident Evil Remake. Its whole purpose was to explain what happened before the mansion incident and what caused the outbreak in Raccoon City. At its core, 0 is a flawed game, because it assumes that we actually want those answers. But the story isn't the worst offender. That goes to the characters. You see, 0 stars Resident Evil 1's least useful character, Rebecca Chambers. In 1 and Remake, if you play as Chris, Rebecca is a medic who spends most of the game attempting to heal Bravo team members. I don't want to rag too hard on Rebecca, cause technically it's Capcom's fault for basically making her a damsel in distress, but everything from her dialogue to the fact that you have to constantly save her from enemies has me questioning how she even joined STARS in the first place. I thought this game might be a redemption for Rebecca, give me a reason to like her, but it ended up doing the opposite. The game pairs Rebecca up with a new character called Billy Cohen, a convict who was on his way to be executed when his truck was attacked by zombies, giving him an opportunity to escape. Billy is Well, when compared to the rest of the Resident Evil characters, he's not exactly amazing, but he's not the worst character in the series. He's the brooding bad boy that's actually a good guy kind of character, and within a few minutes Rebecca seems to forget that he's been accused of murdering over 20 people.
No thanks, Dollface. I've already worn handcuffs.
Think of Cohen like a poorly written Saejima in Yakuza 4, drenched in a little bit of sleazy misogyny. Billy and Rebecca's chemistry is pretty clear. Billy calls her little girl and dollface, and Rebecca desperately tries, and fails, to be taken seriously. Probably due to the fact that she's only 18 at this point. So what happens when you combine bad chemistry with two pretty uninteresting characters? You get a whole lot of nothing. Zero is missing that spice that makes Resident Evil Resident Evil. Rebecca isn't exactly known for her one-liners. Her dialogue consists mainly of her either crying for help or asking Billy,
"Did you kill 23 people?"
This becomes painfully clear when you see the only other important characters in this game. See, while most of the game is about Rebecca and Billy stumbling through an Umbrella facility by accident, the actual plot and side story follows what I like to call Birkin and Wesker, the college years. The few cutscenes they have are so kitschy and over the top, and while Birkin's voice actor definitely isn't perfect, I love Wesker's overly dramatic evil droll.
I will follow my initial plan and lure the STARS members into the mansion. Their superior combat training should make them perfect test subjects.
This all begs the question though. Would Zero be a good game if it starred better protagonists? Honestly, probably not. The game itself is an interesting concept executed extremely poorly. Half of the game is spent in menus, and the lack of an item box is extremely frustrating, especially when you give all your ammo and healing items to one character just to have them whisked away from you in the next scene. Bad Resident Evil games, to me, are a combination of bad game design and weak characters. No one has ever finished a Resident Evil game and gone, well, I was enjoying the bombastic action and ridiculousness, but then Wesker survived a dip in a volcano and the story just stopped making sense. If you have said this, you might want to look for another franchise, but I digress.
So we finally meet.
So, where are we now? In the wake of Village, I think it's important to look back at the Resident Evil franchise and see just how far everything has come along. We can all look back at Umbrella Corps and Operation Raccoon City and have a good laugh, but for all of its growing pains in the 2010s, I'm glad the franchise has found a way to bounce back. Resident Evil 7 and 2 Remake have managed to topple RE5 and 6 in sales numbers, finally proving wrong the myth that survival horror doesn't sell. I've talked about horror game history in the past, and I don't think it's any surprise that Resident Evil has gone first person in the wake of indie horror titans like Amnesia. And sure, the classic fixed camera angles might never come back entirely, but I appreciate Capcom's willingness to try new things. I think an important context of this video is that if you know me or have watched my videos before, you'll know this is all coming from the perspective of a massive Silent Hill fan, and maybe that has colored my perception a little bit. There are a lot of parallels to be made between the two franchises. They both had pretty abysmal times in the 360 generation, for example, but I also don't think they could be any more different. The problem with Silent Hill was that it tried to focus more on action while keeping the aesthetic of why people loved Silent Hill. This is why games like Downpour and Homecoming feel so weird. The tone and the gameplay are at complete odds with one another. But Resident Evil, on the other hand, has always been tonally inconsistent between its gameplay. Sure, the original trilogy is pretty tense, especially when you're wandering Spencer Mansion for the first time, with no herbs, health, ammo, and no way to get to the next save point. But then Chris starts dropping one-liners like he's Bruce Willis in Die Hard.
Yeah, I think we got to the root of that problem.
Resident Evil has always been B-movie schlock, and I mean that in the most endearing way possible. So when I finally got to the later games, it felt completely natural for Resident Evil to go this way, unlike Silent Hill, which felt like it couldn't be drifting any further from its origins. So, as a beaten and battered Silent Hill fan, I accept Resi for all of its faults, its weird eccentricities, and its cheesy one-liners. Because all of my favorite Resident Evil games remember one thing that's very important. They never forget to be entertaining. Thanks for watching this admittedly very self-indulgent video about Resident Evil. Let me know in the comments what your favorite Resident Evil character is, and please stick around if you want to see more videos like this. I'll be making more very soon, so if you want to hit that subscribe button, hit a like, leave a comment, I would really appreciate it. Thanks for watching.